This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa. JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 230 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. My prospect model gets referenced so much over the offseason to the point where I'm sure some of you are sick of those references. I mean, my model even has a parody account on Twitter. I've talked a lot about the inputs that go into it in order to find running backs and wide receivers who look like they'll be able to be successful at the next level. But I thought it would be cool to get a different perspective from someone else who prospects through data. So I hit up my friend and fellow fantasy analyst, Anthony Amico. Anthony's been working on his own models, and he does a lot of testing to see which statistics matter and which ones don't when looking at these running backs and wide receivers. My hope for you while listening to our chat is to obviously learn something, but maybe it might inspire you to start building something yourself. As always, thanks for listening. All right, let's start by getting a little bit philosophical. Why do you think so many scouts are against heavily weighing production when prospecting wide receivers and running backs? Like, why does the eye test have to mean absolutely everything to them?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the heart of it is like, it's just like anything else, right? Like you put a lot of time into something and you want your work to be meaningful. I mean, like, I can't imagine the man hours it takes to grind all that tape, to have to do all that. And then, you know, you go online and people are telling you like what you're doing maybe doesn't matter because like I can do X, Y, or Z and that's maybe quicker or better. So it puts you in a spot to like have to anchor and defend your work instead of maybe being like open to the new research. So I think, you know, if you're looking at all that nuance all the time and that's the basis for your takes, you know, the idea that you can like click a few buttons or something and look at some numbers probably seems a little weird. And it probably doesn't help that maybe some of us in the numbers community take things a little too far in terms of propagating the value of numbers versus the film. I mean, I'm definitely strongly in the camp that both matter. I think you probably are too. Yeah. And it's, you know, we end up having these like weird holy wars on Twitter because like everyone just wants to like make sure that their stuff matters. But, you know.
Right. Yeah. Part of me thinks too that like the approach that numbers driven analysts take, you know, given the fact that like, let's just look at the last 15 or 20 years as analytics have gotten bigger and bigger, it's almost like folks who are into numbers and are prospecting via numbers, you know, we might be able to go about it in a little bit more of a gentle way, right? Like we're there, and I'm not saying you or me necessarily, I just mean the community in general, where we discover something and instead of being understanding and a little bit more empathetic as to what the other side has done for the past 50 years, you know, looking at these guys via film, you know, I think that we can approach it in a way where it doesn't have to be such an attack. You know, it can be, it can come from a place where we're saying, you know what, numbers can help, right? It doesn't, we're not saying that what is being done is a horrible thing. We're saying that here's some added information to make prospecting a little bit more accurate.
Absolutely. And like, I feel as though in football in particular, but like in a lot of sports, like people are just resistant to things that are like outside of the realm of the sport. I mean, like people don't even really hire like coaches if they haven't played the sport before, right? Let alone listen to analysts about like how to draft prospects. Yeah.
I mean, there have been many times in my mentions, people saying, have you ever even played football before? So I definitely feel that. So, Anthony, you've been working on your prospect models for some time now. Can you sort of talk through your approach in building those models and sort of how you've improved the model over the last year or so?
Yeah, so I mean, at first, just obviously just looking for some answers. I mean, the draft is probably my favorite sporting event of the whole year, but figuring out who's going to be like #good and who's taking fantasy drafts is pretty tough. So I started trying to build, you know, like a simple linear regression model using some statistics to predict a player's best PPR season within their first 3 years. I chose that marker just because I felt like, at least in terms of dynasty, like if a player's good and he doesn't do it, if he does something good for fantasy, if he doesn't do it within those first 3 years, it's very likely that that player is no longer on the roster of the team that drafted him. So I thought like that early success was really important. Always, you know, like we were saying before, the film versus stats thing always pops up. So I was kind of like, there has to be a way to maybe quantify like what the game watchers are seeing, even if they're not quantifying it for us. So I just looked at, I just started adding draft scout rankings to my models from NFL Draft Scout. And, big gains were seen in predictiveness. Even bigger gains were seen when I started taking the log of those ranks, not to get too into the weeds, but rankings are obviously very linear. The difference between 9 and 10 is the difference between 99 and 100. But with logs, it's the difference between 1 and 10 is the same as the difference between 10 and 100. So it more highly values the players that we would consider to be really good, and that ended up proving to be valuable as well. So those differences have been big. Over the last year or so, I've changed up the statistics in those models. We'll probably talk a little bit about that later in the show. But I've also just used some different approaches outside of your basic R-squared hunting, as I'll sometimes call it. I've done some threshold testing to see where certain stats matter and how much. And most recently, I've used logistic regression to come up with some probabilities of player success at the next level to give us probably a little bit better of a picture of maybe how likely it is that these players are going to hit for us.
Yeah, so you mentioned the scout rankings as an input in this model. I'm assuming the scout rankings standalone are not as good as this model, or as good as what the model would say, meaning the data that you're inputting alongside with the scout rankings is really what's doing it for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the scout rankings give us a really good baseline to work with, and then we're adding a couple of those key stats that are driving our success even higher.
Right. So what are some of the statistics that you found to sort of be worthwhile when you're looking at running backs? And then have you found that there are things that you think that people just tend to overrate from a statistical standpoint?
Yeah, running back, the stats that I found matter the most have been breakout age, which for me is the age a back hits 130 or more adjusted all-purpose yards per game. Just kind of a number that I picked arbitrarily, but through testing it was working. Final year scrimmage yards per game, and final year yards per scrimmage play, which is something I was just talking to you about a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
That proved to be probably the most important out of all those. Gives us again that nice blend of share in the offense, but also efficiency. In terms of what I think people are overrating, yards per carry, I think is probably overused. Market share of team rush attempts, not necessarily rush yards, but just the attempts. And obviously, all the raw statistics in the rushing department. I think that's probably the biggest misconception in production-based analysis. You start talking about it, people bring up, look at this guy who had all these rushing yards and he was terrible. But that's not really what it's about. I mean, I think that if you're just looking at those raw numbers, you're probably not going to find a ton of things that are useful.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The attempt share is really interesting. I mean, I've seen it matter to a degree, but I've also found that sheer volume just seems to matter more. We're trying to look at how these running backs looked from an attempt standpoint within their offense, obviously, when we're looking at things like market share of rushing attempts, but it just seems like the overall the amount of workload that these players are getting just seems to matter more.
Yeah, raw rush attempts per game was much more valuable just because, I mean, the ability to carry a heavy workload, I think, is a skill. Mm-hmm. And, if you demonstrate that skill in college, it's likely that you could do that at the next level.
Yeah, and I wonder if you could also even look at it from the perspective of if you have a really good running back on your team and he's going to get more volume regardless of what that offense looks like. So if let's say it's a very pass-first offense, well, if you have this game-changing running back, you're probably going to change that offense for that running back, right?
For sure.
So I think that's another reason why maybe the market share numbers didn't look as good as the overall volume. That's really interesting, though. But I'll ask the same for wide receivers. What are sort of some of the worthwhile stats that you've seen that seem to work with wide receivers in their transition to the NFL, and then maybe some numbers that folks tend to overvalue?
Yeah, I mean, I know you've talked about this before on this show, but receiving yards per team pass attempt is fantastic. I mean, it gives you the blend of market share and efficiency. I think that those things matter probably a little bit more at receiver than they do at running back. Breakout age, again, important. That's, for me, age that a player makes a 30% dominator, so the share of receiving yards and touchdowns. Market share of receiving yards on its own is pretty powerful. As is receiving touchdowns per team pass attempt. So breaking it down per team pass attempt definitely proved to be valuable. But some of these bigger share numbers obviously do matter. And then the overrated statistics, I mean, it's similar to running back. I mean, like the raw efficiency, like yards per reception, not incredibly important. I mean, if you have like, if you're breaking it down and you find like this group of really efficient receivers, like maybe that's valuable if they don't meet some other thresholds, but certainly you want to hit some other numbers before you get to that raw efficiency. And I kind of think that we may overrate total dominator too much. So again, like that average of receiving yardage share and touchdown share, like I think like there's thresholds that you want to hit, but I think too often maybe we look at somebody that has like a 40% dominator and we look at someone who has a 35% dominator and we say, oh, well, the first player is like definitely better. But I think really as long as you're hitting some kind of minimum, that stuff ends up being like a little noisy once you get past like certain numbers.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. The other thing too about Dominator that I haven't really talked that much about on this show for whatever reason is that I tend to find more success by breaking up the statistics and the market share numbers instead of combining them like Dominator does. You know, it just gives you a better idea of what that wide receiver sort of did. I mean, you can look at reception share versus yardage share and just find a difference there and just sort of get a feel for what that, not that that's predictive, but to just get a little feel of what that wide receiver did. And then on top of that, I found that standalone, and to your point, you talked about this as well, standalone touchdown numbers are really, really important. And the fact that combined with yardage is really what is bringing together with Dominator. When you're able to separate that, you can see there are certain players who might not have crazy good yardage marks, but they're able to make that jump because their touchdown numbers are just so out of control, or vice versa.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, you want to know what makes these players good. I mean, a guy like, you don't want to compare a guy like a David Sills to a guy like, I don't know, like N'Keal Harry or someone. Like, just like their dominators might end up being like relatively close, but like Sills is scoring like tons and tons and tons of touchdowns. And, Harry is accumulating a ton of yards in his offense. Yeah.
Have you found that any of this is different for tight ends? I do a lot less prospecting with tight ends. It's just not something that I've really jumped into quite yet. So I'm curious as your thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely haven't been as extensive with the tight ends like you were saying, but a lot of the stuff that I've looked at has actually said that just getting the ball is predictive of success. So like receptions per game, whether it's final season or career, like those are the numbers that pop the most for me. So it just seems like if your college offense is throwing to the tight end at all at like a decent rate, like that means the guy's probably pretty good.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and ask something that's not necessarily related to just the statistics and the box score scouting. But is the combine meaningful? Have you found that there's any meaning there within your models?
Yeah, I think the combine is really meaningful. I mean, athleticism, speed score in particular is like really important for running backs. Like that's actually in my running back model.
Same.
But even just like aside from the models, and I think without doing too much testing of it, I do think that athleticism probably matters a lot at tight end. Samples are a little harder to get there, but even if the athleticism is not popping in a lot of the models, otherwise, like I've just looked at some of the stuff with Spark, and like you want guys to hit like some minimum thresholds. Like it may not be important to run like a 4.3. But like if you're trying to draft a receiver that runs like a 4.9, I'm obviously being excessive, but like that's a problem, right? Like you want guys to hit minimum levels of athleticism, in some way. I mean, this is using Spark, but like just looking at the Spark stuff, like if you hit a couple minimum thresholds, like your success rate does go way up. It's just that like reaching the ends of the ranges isn't really important. You just have to be like above replacement or above a certain level, and I think that makes sense considering these guys are entering the most athletic league in the sport that they play.
Right. Yeah, no, it absolutely makes sense. I mean, when Elijah Holyfield did what he did in the 40, I think that there's a lot of reason for people to freak out. It makes a lot of sense to freak out at that bad of a 40-yard dash, whereas someone like David Montgomery, he runs his slower than what we would want from a top back in the class, but at least we've seen successes within that range before.
Definitely.
So given the work that you've done with your model, who are some running backs you seem to like more or less than the consensus this year?
Well, the first two guys, Darrell Henderson and Travion Williams, like they're probably my top two backs. So I guess by definition, like I'm higher on them than a lot of other people. They both averaged over 2 yards per scrimmage play. And they ran well enough in the 40 to not kill their speed scores, even though it wasn't. I think we kind of expected both of those guys to run a little faster, but still pretty good. But some guys that are maybe a little lower, Raquel Armstead out of Temple and Alex Barnes out of Kansas State. Armstead had the best speed score at the combine. A little bit of a slow running back group, but it's still a 4.45 at 220 pounds is pretty good. 1.6 yards per scrimmage play was still better than over 75% of the running backs in this class. So he, I think, has some sleeper appeal. Barnes, people have been talking about a lot more. He just falls into this list of like weight-adjusted agility freaks, and only 19 running backs since 2000 have an agility score better than 11.1 seconds total at 220 or more pounds. 6 of those guys had at least one season of 200 or more PPR points. 10 of them had at least 130. So it seems likely that Barnes will be fantasy relevant at some point. I mean, the list was loaded with guys taken in the top 100, which is probably the most important thing, like just the opportunity to get the opportunity to have an opportunity. So those are the guys I like more. And then I think less Montgomery, who you mentioned, Damian Harris, and Devin Singletary are probably all guys I like a little less than consensus. I haven't seen Singletary move too much on rankings, which is surprising to me after the combine.
Agreed.
I just have athleticism questions for all these guys. I think Montgomery probably the least so because he is at least a little bit bigger, but Harris is smaller, Singletary is smaller, and to not have that speed, I think, is a red flag. Not really agile either. And the production for Harris in particular is obviously terrible. I mean, he played in the same offense as Josh Jacobs, who other people like, but wasn't really able to control enough of that offense to put up decent production. Singletary has really good production in year 2, but the drop off from year 2 to year 3 concerns me. I think maybe in his frame, like it's possible he just can't handle the work. And again, with Montgomery, I'm just a little bit worried. I think if the productivity was a little bit higher, I'd excuse the athleticisms more, but he's kind of like just above average. He's not great. And I think the big thing for me with Montgomery is like I'm not like afraid to take him. I just see him as like a consensus top 2 guy, and I don't really have him that high.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think it's very fair. 2 guys you mentioned there, though, Alex Barnes. I did a study that I talked about on this show, so folks definitely know the name Alex Barnes. But if you look at final season production, he was one of the freaks at the position from a final season production standpoint. Now, he didn't get that production until that final year, but the fact that he tested really well, I'm totally on board with Alex Barnes, as are you. But then the Devin Singletary thing, I'm sort of shocked that there are so many red flags with him as a prospect, and people just seem to ignore it. He's not big. He's not coming from a big school. And then the other thing too, his receiving marks, he lost reception share each season in college. I think that's another flag that folks should at least pay some attention to. So I think that there's enough flags there to be concerned. But the general gist, and maybe you agree with me or maybe you disagree with me. I just think it's a very landing spot dependent running back class.
Oh, totally agree. I mean, that's the thing. Like in general, we do so much analysis on these guys, and then it's like, oh well. If they're not going to get the work, like what the heck does it all matter,
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm totally with you on that.
So what about wide receivers? Which guys do you seem to like more or like less?
I mean, we're obviously going to talk about Andy Isabella.
Oh yeah, hell yeah.
Not just a sleeper. Like he's legit. I mean, the 4.33 receiving yards per team pass attempt last year. The only receiver in my database, which goes back to like 2003. I'm sure there's guys that I'm missing, but the only guy that's higher and didn't go to Georgia Tech is Des Bryant. So really good company there. Obviously, he crushed the 40, which we all expected, even though we had a little bit of a scare there.
There was an hour there where everything in life sucked because Andy Isabella ran like a 4.56.
I was freaking out.
Yeah, it was awful. It was terrible.
And he was awesome against the Power 5. I mean, this year, 15 catches for 219 yards and 2 touchdowns against Georgia. I mean, that's legit, man. Like I'm all in on that guy. Really like Marquise Brown as well. I mean, the foot injury is a big concern, but he was outstanding the last 2 years at Oklahoma. Obviously, he probably played with like the number 1 pick in the draft each of those 2 years, but was really explosive. If he can retain that post injury, he's potentially the best receiver in the class. And the other guy I'm kind of just holding out hope for is Greg Dortch. I mean, his pro day is actually Wednesday, so there's a good chance by the time you're listening to this, we have some testing numbers on him, but I'm a little concerned that he didn't participate at the combine. It's possible he's not that athletic, but if he is, I mean, career 2.84 receiving yards per team pass attempt, 38% share of the receiving yards, dynamic in the return game. So like there's definitely some upside here if you can test to be reasonably athletic. But I think if not, like maybe we're looking at like a Jamison Crowder type of guy. The guys I like less, Paris Campbell, I'm not really on board with. Yeah, just seems like a less productive version of Curtis Samuel, who I liked Curtis Samuel, but like he hasn't really taken off yet. Not really sure if his future is even at receiver. He could be like a Theo Riddick type where he ends up at running back and he's catching a bunch of passes. That would obviously be fine, but I don't think he's maybe worth like a first round rookie pick if we're thinking like his best path to success is changing positions. And Kelvin Harmon was disappointing. I mean, he tested poorly athletically. He's older than I first thought he was, which was like some weird, like John Moore found like some weird tweets where it was like, no, like this dude's actually like a year older than everyone thinks. And the production to me is just like very average. So that's probably my list.
Yeah, no, I dig it. The Harmon thing's kind of interesting too, because a lot of folks had him as maybe even the number one wide receiver in this class pre-combine. But the more I looked at it from a production standpoint and from a production profile standpoint, I saw J.J. Arcega-Whiteside as just a better version of him.
Definitely. I'm totally with you. Arcega-Whiteside is like legit touchdown scorer, younger, gets all these yards in an offense that wasn't even really that good this year. I'm with you on that.
Sweet. So Anthony, before I let you go, give me one bold take about this year's class as it pertains to fantasy football.
I mean, you know where I'm going with this. I mean,
Let's hear it.
Andy Isabella will have the best fantasy season over the next 3 years of any wide receiver in this draft class.
Woo, I love it, man. I love it. I love me some Andy Isabella. Anthony, thanks so much for spending some time on the show today. I really do appreciate it. If any of you aren't following Anthony on Twitter, you can find him at Amicsta, and of course you can find me on there at Late Round QB. And make sure you're subscribed to the Late Round Podcast by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. Thanks again to Anthony for hopping on today, and I'll talk to you guys later in the week.